Well, welcome to Hawthorn University's Holistic Health and Nutrition webinar, and I sure want to thank you so much for joining us as we host Beth O'Hara for her exciting presentation on slipping through the cracks, mast cell activation. Mast cell activation syndrome is one of the most under-recognized and overlooked conditions that affects between 9 to 17% of the general population, but well over 50% of the chronically ill population, which is a growing population in our country. So if you work in healthcare, you're bound to see those that are affected by mast cell activation syndrome. And you could be at the forefront in your practice knowing how to recognize and then support clients with this condition. So I just think this is such an important and timely topic, Beth. You know, it's such an honor and really a delight to have you presenting for us today. So welcome.
Thank you so much, and I'm really excited to be here. And I want to share my camera for just a moment and just share a little bit about why I got started in this and some background. So I wanted to be a doctor from the time I was 6 years old. And actually, initially I said I was going to be a nurse because I didn't know any female doctors where I was growing up. And my mother told me, you know, why not just be a doctor? And so that set me on this course. But I also had all these mysterious health issues as a child. And by the time I was 12, I was on numerous medications. And when I got into my undergraduate, I was working hard. I had a full scholarship to medical school, which is hard to get, but my body crashed. And I knew there was no way, if I made it through the courses, that I would make it through residency. And so instead of becoming a doctor, I wanted to be a neurologist. Instead of becoming a neurologist, I became a chronically ill patient. And I exhausted everything that traditional medicine had to offer. And the medications usually were making me worse. And then I found alternative healthcare. I found integrative medicine. I found functional medicine. At one point, I totaled up, I'd seen over 50 different doctors. And by the time I was 28, I was walking with a cane. And I was bedridden. I had bouts of not being able to get out of bed. I had severe anxiety and panic attacks. I had joint pain to where it felt like ground glass in my joints, and no one could figure out what to do with me. The best practitioners told me they had never seen anyone as sensitive as I was, and I was reacting to sprinkles of quercetin and little bits of curcumin that should be helping with inflammation, but did not work for me. I took an eighth of a tablet of a medication to help with anxiety, and my body temperature dropped to below 96, and my organs slowed down because of the nervous system effects. And I couldn't get warm. I couldn't get to the bathtub. My husband had to put me in the tub. So this was my life in my 20s and 30s, my early 30s. And when the best trained, most experienced functional medicine practitioner that I had access to, this was before we had telehealth, the person I had access to told me, you know, we've worked together for 3 years. You've tried everything I've asked you to try. I don't know what else to do. I sobbed first all the way home because if he didn't know, who was going to know? And I had to make a choice. Was I going to give up, or was I going to figure this out? And I decided, you know, I had some background with pre-med. I'm going to figure this out. I figured out I had mast cell activation syndrome. And then I figured out I wasn't alone. It was just that most people hadn't seen this. And that's where I started putting these pieces together. So I was slipping through the cracks, and at one point really thought that I wouldn't survive. But I got my life back. I got my health back. And it's my passion and my mission to share this with people and to share this knowledge, because if you're a healthcare practitioner, you will have people with this in your practice. And I want as many healthcare practitioners as possible to know how to work with this.
So nobody else slips through the cracks.
Exactly.
Absolutely. What a sad and powerful story, though, and all too common, unfortunately. And I'm just so thankful that you're on this side of it and here helping us understand this better and know how to implement. So
Thank
I'm
you.
going to proceed with your bio and the rest of the introductions, and then we'll have you start the presentation. Is that all right?
Yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, let's go just a little bit. As Beth just said, she's a functional naturopath. She specializes in complex chronic immune conditions related to mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance. She's the founder and owner of Mast Cells 360, a functional naturopathy practice designed to look at all factors surrounding health conditions, being genetic, epigenetic, biochemical, physiological, environmental, and emotional. That's a true holistic practice there. Her subspecialties are mold toxicity and genetic analysis in the area of mast cell activation and histamine intolerance. She designed Mast Cell 360 to be the kind of practice she wished she had existed when she was severely ill with mast cell activation syndrome, histamine intolerance, neural inflammation, Lyme, mold toxicity, fibromyalgia, and chronic fatigue. Her mission today is to be a guiding light for others with mast cell activation syndrome, histamine intolerance, and these related conditions in their health journeys. So through Mast Cell 360 root causes process, she discovers the unique root factors that are affecting each of her clients' health issues, building personalized, effective roadmaps for healing. She holds a doctorate in functional naturopathy, a master's degree in marriage and family therapy, and a bachelor's degree in physiological psychology. She's a certified functional genomic analysis and is a research advisor for the Nutrigenetic Research Institute. She presents at functional medicine conferences on mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance, as well as the use of genetics and biochemistry in addressing chronic health conditions. So with all of that, today we're going to learn together what mast cell activation syndrome is and what the symptoms are, how mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance are connected, what the root causes of mast cell activation syndrome are, and what the important first steps in supporting people with mast cell activations are. And then finally, we'll get a good understanding of mast cell activation syndrome with a case study. So goodness, Beth, you're going to cover a wide range here. So thank you for going so deeply into this.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a complex topic. And I want people to know this is going to be a lot of information. So plan on going back and watching it a couple times. Don't feel like you've got to get it all the first pass, because I'm distilling down about the last 10 years of experience for people here.
And you brought up a good point there, Beth, that we are recording this. We'll likely go 75 minutes for the presentation and follow that with your questions. So please write your questions or your comments into the webinar question panel at any time, and we'll certainly respond after Beth presents. Okay, when you're ready, Beth.
All right. So this is my contact information. If you're looking for more on mast cell activation syndrome, you can find lots of info at our blog there or our Facebook account. And I'll put this up at the end too, if you're looking for that. Just a reminder that this is for information and educational purposes. This is not meant to treat, diagnose, or prevent illness. So we're looking here at mast cell activation is really the perfect storm. And I'm going to explain how different kinds of issues that you're likely to see in your practice, allergies, food sensitivities, asthma, sleep issues, GI problems, mold toxicity, how these are often related, including a number of other types of symptoms. These are often the mystery people who go from person to person. No one's figuring it out, similar to the story that I just shared with you. Most of the people in my practice have seen a minimum of 5 practitioners before we meet. Many of them have seen 10 or more. And it's just because mast cell activation can manifest in so many different types of presentations that there's no classic one. It's not an easy thing that you can put in a box, but I want to help you know how to recognize it and some clues that you can have for identifying if somebody may have mast cell activation issues. So let's start with the mast cells themselves. This is a great diagram of the mast cell. And what you can see is that the mast cells have, this is a very simple diagram. The mast cells actually have hundreds of receptors. And you can see we've got different types of receptors here. So this is the toll-like receptor you may hear of, and this is a receptor for different types of pathogens. And we have opioid receptors, hormone receptors, we have receptors for IgE antigens, we have receptors for neurotransmitters and neuropeptides, and most of the things that are going on in the body. So you can think of the mast cells as being one of the first responders of the immune system. And they are positioned in all kinds of areas of the body where the body meets the outside world. So all of the mucosal and epithelial tissues. So these are going to include like the lining of your nose and your sinuses, the tissues around your eyes, all of the tissue in your mouth, and the entire lining of the digestive tract, including the lining of the bladder, the urethra, the lungs. All of this, they're lined with mast cells. All of the vascularized tissues are lined with mast cells. All of our connective tissues, so this includes ligaments, tendons, our bones, blood vessels, lymph vessels, even the hair follicles and skin. People, not everyone with mast cell activation syndrome, but some people with mast cell activation syndrome will say that their hair hurts, and it's their hair follicles. I've had that myself. You can have pain in your hair follicles. And then also the nerve tissue and the brain, and we're going to come back to this. This is very important, that we have mast cells at all of the nerve endings and in the brain. This is a small sampling of mast cell mediators. There are hundreds of mast cell mediators, and the most up-to-date count I've seen is there are over 1,000. So this is again why they're so complex, and mast cell activation can be complex. So we have our most well-known mediator is histamine. We have other types of polyamines, proteoglycans, which include heparin. Heparin is used by the mast cells to stabilize themselves in the form of heparin sulfate. So sulfates are critical for the health of the mast cells. Chondroitin sulfates. And we've got a number of other things. I find this fascinating that beta glucuronidase is also made by mast cells. And if you've gotten into gut health and looking at any kind of gut tests, you'll know that beta glucuronidase can also be created by what we would call pathogenic bacteria in the gut, but the mast cells can also produce it. It produces inflammation. We have different types of proteases. Tryptases are one of them that you'll see often. And then even serotonin, mast cells can release serotonin, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, VEGF, PDGF, and then cytokines we've been hearing quite a lot of recently in the media. The mast cells are one of the major producers in the body of cytokines. These are some of the more common cytokines like TNF alpha, TGF beta that you'll see, IFN gamma. We have interleukins, including interleukin 6, which there's been a lot of research on lately with COVID, chemokines, and substance P, which there's a lot of research on substance P and chronic fatigue and pain. So if you think about these mast cells are at the front line, sensing for anything that's going on in the environment. They're sensing changes in heat and cold that are registered by the nervous system. They're sensing toxins, they're sensing pathogens, and then they're going to send out signals to the immune system, the rest of the immune system, using these different mediators. They're also going to send signals to the nervous system that I'm going to show you more here in a bit. And so let me skip ahead here. So this is just another look here of our mast cells and some of the different activity of a few of these mediators. So some of the mediators, like the histamine, the heparin, the proteases, the chondroitin sulfate, recruit and activate other immune cells, so you get this immune signaling. Some of the cytokines, the chemokines, and the growth factors are involved in phagocytosis. This is where the immune cells are engulfing pathogens and also antimicrobial activity. We have involvement in tissue repair, vascular permeability, and getting rid of toxins. So what is mast cell activation syndrome? So this is a dysregulation of the mast cells where they become overreactive and over-release the inflammatory mediators. Here's something that's important to distinguish. If you've heard anything about mast cell activation syndrome before, mast cells, they've kind of gotten this bad rap that the mast cells are causing all the problems. You need to knock that response out. The biggest theme of this talk is going to be that the mast cells are not the problem. And what we're going to look at what is the problem. So we want to think about it not in terms of how do you just knock that response out, because you saw that mast cells are responding to toxins and responding to pathogens. So if you knock that response out, you've knocked out part of the immune system. It's like taking out your police department, your fire department, and your EMTs. Who's going to respond to the emergencies? And who's going to alert on a larger level that there are emergencies? We want to look at why, what's going underneath. And part of the reason I became so sick was because I mentioned in my introduction that I was put on a number of medications. I was put on a lot of antihistamines and other types of mast cell stabilizing medications, which made sense at the time, and that was the best that we had. Now, given that, it wiped out my defenses, and I had significant mold colonization in my body, mold toxicity, which we'll talk about some more. I had Lyme, Bartonella, and Babesia, and the medications made it to where those had free reign in my body, and I couldn't fight them off anymore. So that my symptoms improved short term, and I felt much better for a couple years, and then I became much, much worse to where I was bedridden eventually. We don't have to do that anymore. So we have lots of other ways to address this. And I have my health back, I have my life back. I run a very busy practice. I can run on the treadmill at 3 miles, well, that's a walk, 3 miles an hour, but that's huge for somebody who used to be bedridden and on a cane. I can go hiking and live a normal life other than I have some health maintenance to do. The other reason I'm so passionate about this is one of the most common, overlooked, and under-recognized conditions affecting Western populations. Epidemiological studies have shown that mast cell activation syndrome is present in between 9 and 17% of the general population. So to put that into context, if you think of 10 people that you know, one of them has mast cell activation syndrome. That's at a minimum. If we're going with the higher end of those studies, then we're looking at possibly 1 in 9 people, and around between 1 in 8, 1 in 9 people. Clinical observation predicts that mast cell activation syndrome is present in significantly more than 50% of the chronically ill population. So healthy people don't usually come into our practice unless you have a performance type of practice. We get chronically ill people. In that population, you're going to see more than 50% having mast cell activation syndrome. And I'm going to put the dots together as to why. So let's look at some of our symptoms that you're going to see, symptom presentations. Systemic symptoms, I'm going to break this down by systems. Systemic symptoms are going to include overall fatigue and malaise. Sensitivity is very common. If you see food sensitivities, if you see chemical sensitivities, environmental sensitivities, people don't do well with their husband's cologne. They can't use anything fragranced, even though we know we shouldn't be using fragrance anyway, but not everybody is immediately sensitive to that. That should be a tip-off. Chills, sweats are possible. Don't see those often, but they're possible. I see those more with Bartonella. Sense of being cold all the time. Inflammation is common. Swelling is common. Sometimes you'll see swollen lymph nodes. Sometimes you'll see weight change. Now, people are not going to have all of these symptoms. Part of the diagnostic criteria, and we'll go into the other pieces, part of the diagnostic criteria is there are symptoms in 2 or more systems, but they're not going to have all of the symptoms and they're not going to be in all of the systems. So when we look at musculoskeletal symptoms, we have osteoporosis or osteopenia have been linked, and this is all in the research literature. This is not just observation. This is what's in the research literature. Myalgia is arthritis that moves around, general muscular and bone pain, hyperflexible joints and hypermobility are linked, degenerative disc issues are linked. And these are, if we think about the degenerative disc, that's part of inflammation. Mast cells are one of the major inflammation producing cells in the body. And the role should be to produce that inflammation for injury healing, for surrounding pathogens and toxins. But when we get mast cell activation syndrome, the inflammation gets out of control. Skin symptoms can include itching, flushing, hives. You'll see sometimes easy bruising. Reddish or pale complexion on either side are common. I've never worn blush because my cheeks are always red and I look like a clown if I put blush on. And so look for that reddish, ruddy kind of complexion or pale. Burning sensations can occur. Dermatographia is where if somebody scratches their arm, then the redness or the white marks will remain. So sometimes people can write their name in their arm, or you can do a skin scratch test if somebody's not very sensitive. Now, I don't do this if somebody's really, really sensitive skin, but somebody scratches like they would scratch a mosquito bite, that should go away quickly. If that doesn't, then you may have some skin involvement, so something to think about. Slow healing, you can have hair loss, rosacea is linked, psoriasis, eczema, all linked. Another clue can be mosquito bite reactions that are larger than normal. So that can be related to mast cell activation syndrome. Now, not everybody has skin symptoms. And one of the struggles people have had, and I hear stories every week about, in the allergy and immunology community, there is, for many, not all, but for many, there is a misunderstanding that you cannot have mast cell activation syndrome if you do not have skin symptoms. And that's just not true. And that's part of the education we need to continue to do. So I have people with the classic skin symptoms. I have people with no skin symptoms. Now, in the cardiovascular system, people may feel faint or even have fainting. They may have chest pains that are not heart attack related, fast heartbeat, heart palpitations, dizziness, lightheadedness, low blood pressure. Digestive symptoms are quite common, and these can include mouth burning, gum inflammation, diarrhea or constipation, cramping, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, reflux, trouble swallowing, throat tightness, issues with absorption because of gut inflammation, bloating, elevation of liver enzymes, high cholesterol, food sensitivities or food allergies, irritable bowel syndrome, sometimes obesity. And then in the brain and nervous system, we can have brain fog, short-term memory issues, trouble with word recall, headaches, migraine, depression, loss of pleasure in life, nerve pain, attention issues, anxiety, insomnia, dizziness, tinnitus, numbness, sweating, temperature changes, tingling and numbness in the arms and legs. In the lung and respiratory symptoms, congestion, coughing, shortness of breath, wheezing, asthma, increased mucus production and postnasal drip. When people have the respiratory symptoms, they'll often have a throat clearing. You might hear kind of a and that's trying to clear that postnasal drip. And then sinus congestion, well, we've got the throat clearing on there. Sinus or nasal swelling are common, sometimes nasal polyps. In the eyes, you can have eye pain, redness, trouble focusing, inflammation in the eyes, blurry, itchy, water, irritated eyes. Reproductive systems, so you can see the mast cells are in all of these systems. So again, this is why this can be confusing for people when we want something that's very clear cut. But in the reproductive system, we might have endometriosis, painful periods, infertility, hormonal imbalances. Urinary tract symptoms can include inflammation of tissues, burning, pain with urination, urinary tract infection type symptoms. I often see those come along with oxalates that will scrape the tissue on a microscopic level and aggravate the mast cells as they're being excreted. And then anaphylaxis, anaphylactoid reactions. So these can include difficulty breathing, itchy hives, flushing or pale skin, warmth, weak or rapid pulse, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, dizziness, fainting. Now, not everyone has anaphylaxis or anaphylactoid. That's kind of an overwhelming and dizzying list of symptoms, possible symptoms. So again, you can see the problem with really trying to hone this in. What you're looking for are symptoms in 2 or more systems that cannot be clarified or explained by another condition. That's part of the diagnostic criteria that is currently we're operating with. And that diagnostic criteria was only accepted or official in 2016 was when Mast Cell Activation Syndrome was given an ICD-10 code. That diagnostic criteria also includes that the person has to have an elevation in one of the mast cell mediators. So it could be histamine, tryptase, interleukins, leukotrienes, prostaglandins. And the person has to respond to or have improvement from taking a mast cell stabilizing or antihistamine medication. There are a few problems with this diagnostic criteria, and I just want you to know about it because people may come to you and say, well, my allergist told me that I don't meet the diagnostic criteria. But we don't want to rule it out because that diagnostic criteria is still young, it's still in flux and evolving. In talking with my colleagues, we are finding that only about 10% of people with mast cell activation syndrome ever have an elevation in one of the mediators on a blood or urine test. Part of that is because those mediators are up and down quickly, so you have to catch it. And if anybody's working under insurance purposes and has to get a diagnosis, some practitioners are having their clients provoke a flare in order to get an elevation, or they'll do a baseline reading of, say, tryptase, provoke a flare, and then get a comparative value. Provoking a flare can be problematic in people with mast cell activation syndrome, and it still may not catch it. So that's a problem. Another problem with this criteria is that the medications, every mast cell and antihistamine medication that I've seen to date, other than cromolyn sodium, has excipients that are mast cell triggers. So dyes, titanium dioxide, we'll look at some of these in a bit. And so people can be reacting to those, and the medication, if it were compounded, may have been helpful or may have alleviated symptoms because they're reacting to the excipients, then they're ruled out of this diagnosis. So you can see why I'm passionate about that, getting that evolving, because it's missing a lot of people. Now I want to look at other conditions that are related to mast cell activation syndrome. Again, this is in the research literature. So fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, interstitial cystitis, if you see those are tipped off. Certain cancers, mast cells have a whole role in cancer, which is a completely different topic and not my expertise here, but I wanted you to know about it. Crohn's disease and irritable bowel syndrome, diabetes, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So there are several different subtypes of Ehlers-Danlos. Most of them are genetic, and they're going to cause issues with hypermobility in the joints, and some of them, they can cause issues in the organs or vascularized tissue, and all of that tissue is going to be too spongy. There is a strong link between that and mast cell activation syndrome, as well as POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. This is basically where somebody has major fluctuations in blood pressure, especially lying down and then standing up. Now, there was a study, if you look it up, there was a review study that said that these are definitely not linked. And the person that wrote that study has some agendas, and they left out every study that did confirm the link. So I don't think that that was a good research article if you pull that up. There's also very clear evidence of autism spectrum disorders and mast cell activation syndrome because of the number of mast cells in the brain, and autism is a neuroinflammatory condition. Most autoimmunity is linked with mast cell activation syndrome because of the signaling from the mast cells to the rest of the immune system, and I will discuss that here in a moment. So rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Hashimoto's, multiple sclerosis, most autoimmunity that you can think of. Let's talk about why the mast cells aren't the problem. And this is going to get a little in depth here. There's lots of follow-up reading you can do. So I'm going to keep this high level so we can keep moving. But I want you to know about cell danger response. So it's called cell danger response. This is the work of Robert Navia. This was major groundbreaking work. And cell danger response is a systemic response, a systemic metabolic response that our bodies developed evolutionarily, and it's designed to protect us from harm, whether we're talking about chemical or physical or pathogens. When those exceed our body's capacity to address them, we go into what's called cell danger response. And this is one of Robert Navia's diagrams showing the different phases. Now, you don't have to know what all these phases are and get into the details right now unless you're really excited about this, and you can follow it up. But what happens when mold toxins or Lyme or chemical toxins become too great for the body to keep up with? There's this cascade of these biochemical and even bioelectrical changes that happen. And we get this extracellular release of ATP and some other intermediates like reactive oxygen species. And then the body goes into kind of I think of it like a lockdown mode. So the metaphor I use with my clients is if we have this complex factory with assembly lines running through it, and the assembly lines feed into one another, and they're all adding another product. So this is a metaphor for the biochemistry that happens in our bodies. And then you have a fire over in sector C. You're not going to keep the assembly lines running. You're going to shut things down so that you can put the fire out. And that's what our bodies will start to do. So they'll shut things down. These are some of the things that happen in cell danger response. The stiffening of cell membranes happen. You can think about sometimes people can't get nutrients into the cells. Why is that? This is part of why. We get methylation changes. So if you see somebody who's not tolerating methyl donors like methylfolate, methyl B12, likely there's a good chance that they're in cell danger response. Vitamin D goes down. Vitamin D production goes down. HDC stands for histidine decarboxylase. This is an enzyme in the body that converts histidine, the amino acid in our proteins, to histamine. It's our body's way of producing that histamine out of the amino acid. When that goes up, we get this increased mast cell and eosinophil activity. Heme activity gets altered. Tryptophan gets shunted away from making serotonin and melatonin to chymotonic and quinolinic, which are neuroinflammatory. We stop excreting metals, and metals accumulate. We get bowel changes like constipation, diarrhea, leaky gut, mitochondrial changes. So if our body is intentionally doing this and going into cell danger response, then if somebody has underlying mold toxins, Lyme, Bartonella, any other kind of underlying toxicity or chronic pathogens, and we start adding vitamin D or methyl donors too early, or we start trying to detox metals, people aren't going to respond well. So this is key information if you ever deal with a sensitive person or work with sensitive populations. This will really help drive how you approach them and how you work with them. So in Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, I'm going to talk about mold toxicity here in a little bit, but if they're dealing with mold or Lyme, you'll often see poor responses to doing phosphatidylcholine too early, methylation supports too early, doing B6 in the form of P5P, that's a cofactor for that HDC enzyme that converts histidine to histamine. For some, low carbs can be a problem. That's part of the heme pathway issue. It's not for everybody, but if somebody tells you, I feel really sick if I go low carb, listen to them, because they can be thrown into a porphyric attack. And some people truly can't lower carbs. Now, that's not everybody, but I deal with the people that fall through the cracks. So that's who we're talking about here. Metal detox, if we try to do that before mold gets addressed, we can get a poor response. If we try to do antimicrobials for the gut before we address things like mold, so there's an order of operations here. If we try to do mitochondrial supports too early, things like CoQ10, these are going to work against that cell danger response. So we want to think about what is the real problem here. So Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, allergies, asthma, food sensitivities, gut imbalances, these things that are most commonly associated, these are not the actual problem. It's the underlying pathogens, the underlying toxins, the genetic weaknesses that are the problem. And so this is one of the big key takeaways I want people to have, is that things like Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, things like asthma, these are expressions of that cell danger response. Food sensitivities and gut imbalances often are as well. And so again, it's always like, what's the bottommost layer here? But the very good news is that by addressing those underlying root factors, people with Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, with these other types of issues, can recover, and they can recover very well. So let's look at our root triggers here. Number one root trigger I see in my practice, and this is now about 90% of the people that I work with, have mold toxicity. This has become an epidemic level issue for a few reasons. In the 1970s, building codes changed, so we now build buildings tighter, and we seal in the moisture and we get condensation in the walls, and higher humidity levels in our homes and schools and commercial buildings than we've ever had before. Then about 20 years ago, we started bringing in Wi-Fi routers. And studies are showing, we need more studies, but preliminary studies are showing that mold grown in the presence of a Wi-Fi router grows up to 600 times faster than it does without the presence of Wi-Fi. And we have so many Wi-Fi devices, our laptops and our tablets, and now we have multiple routers in homes and boosters and all of these things. So that's a key component. And schools are particularly notorious because the schools close up usually for the summer, same for college dorms, and all of that humidity gets trapped inside. Well, if you have humidity over 50% for more than a couple of days, you're going to have mold growth. And these are some of the reasons why this has become a huge, huge issue. Other major root triggers can be food triggers, and we talk about things like we talk about dairy, but also things like lectins and oxalates for some people. So lectins are a category of protein in some foods like nightshades, tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, sunflower seeds, pumpkin, squashes, and even wheat, corn. Most of our grains have lectins, Mast cells actually have a lectin receptor on the outside that evolved to detect fungal species, but it also can detect those lectins in foods. We have inflammatory triggers, and these can include things like iron dysregulation and EMFs. We have chemical and metal toxicities, different kinds of chronic infections, genetic factors, nutritional imbalances and hypoxia, hormone imbalances, stress, and early trauma. This is quite a lot to think about, and I'm clear on that. I do have a report, if anybody wants to download it, where I go into some more details on these. So you can download it here at mastcell360.com/free report. Now, with these root triggers, if you only learn to work with mold toxicity, so if you can work with mold toxicity and you can work with the nervous system, so mold toxicity, if you can work with the nervous system imbalances, you're going to help a huge amount of people. And those are the two starting places that I go to initially in my practice. I want to connect here the nervous system piece. This is crucial and one that I'm not seeing very many people touching on. And if you can bring this into your practice as well, you will have quite a unique niche that will be really instrumental for people. So we're thinking about the autonomic nervous system primarily here. So this is going to include our sympathetic, parasympathetic, and then the enteric nervous system that connects to all of the abdominal organs. So this is just a slide. You can look at the slides later, but it shows you what are the sympathetic actions, the parasympathetic actions. Generally, we think about kind of loosely sympathetic as being fight or flight, and parasympathetic as being that rest, heal, digest, restore response. In our culture, I have yet to meet anyone who was not somewhat in a more sympathetic dominant state, if we want to call it that loosely. So we have bills, we have traffic, now we have quarantines and lockdowns and fears about political changes and fears about pathogens and viruses, and there's always something happening in our lives. So in Western culture, we do not live in a balanced lifestyle. Even people who work from home, I don't see them well balanced unless they're doing a nervous system protocol. So then the enteric nervous system, again, this is going to connect from the vagal pathways to the esophagus and the trachea. So sometimes you'll see people with food sensitivities, they might get throat closing. This part of the nervous system response connects with the stomach, the gallbladder, and so gallbladder pain can be related. I have a woman who gets burning pain in her right shoulder every time she eats, and it's a nervous system referral from the gallbladder. And then connects to the pancreas, connects to the whole GI tract there. Another part we're just going to do very high level that you want to think about with Mast Cell Activation Syndrome is the limbic system. The limbic system includes the amygdala, the hippocampus, in the brain, the thalamus, and what's not shown on here is the olfactory nerve coming in from the nose. So this olfactory nerve comes straight into these parts of the brain here. Our limbic system evolved to help us recognize danger. And the way that you can think about this is if you've ever been hiking out in nature or you've been in a dark alley at night and all of a sudden the hair on the back of your neck stands up, you know something's wrong and you better get out of there. You smelled something. You might have smelled a wild animal. You might have smelled fear hormones coming off of a person. You smelled something. You may not even register that you smelled something, but it was enough that your limbic system registered, and it's now sending signals that there's danger, you better get out of here. So this is a key component with the mast cells, and I'm going to show you that in one moment. The last part of our anatomy here are the vagal nerves. The vagal nerves come out between the skull and the first vertebrae. And then the vagal nerves, it's the longest nerve in the body, and it innervates goes from the brain to the heart to the gut, which I think is really cool because we have 3 ways of processing information. We talk about not just what does your head tell you, but what does your heart say or what's your gut telling you. It also connects to the other abdominal organs. So the intestines, vagal nerve is very important in motility, connects to the liver, the diaphragm, the spleen. So this mast cell nervous system link, there's a whole field of study called psychoneuroendocrinoimmunology. And this is what I did my master's research in this area in Mast Cell Activation Syndrome. So this is a field of study that's been established for 40 years. Psycho refers, of course, to our mind state, neuro to our nervous system, endocrino to the hormone system, immuno to the immune system. So where we learn anatomy in a way that is systematized so that we can digest it and get it under our belts, we learn our nervous system, then we learn about the hormone system, and we learn about the immune system. And then we might have some classes in psychology, right? Mind states and stress. But this is actually how these systems connect. So this is a great diagram that I like. This was in the Journal of Psychoneuroimmunology, and it's showing how stress chemicals, so stress will trigger stress hormones from the brain to come down and affect our immune system, and not just T cell development, but also immune cell responses. So this is clearly demonstrating our stress to immune system responses here. In mast cell activation, I have not had a person yet that did not have some level of a dysregulated nervous system. And nervous system dysregulation is involved in the POTS that we talked about earlier, and the blood pressure changes, autoimmune disorders, gut motility issues, neuropathy. Tinnitus is a big one, and if you have people with tinnitus, there's other causes. So I'm not saying that I'm not saying this is the only cause, but mold toxins often cause tinnitus by disrupting the mast cell nervous system axis here. Complex regional pain syndrome, highly involved here. Ehlers-Danlos, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, irritable bowel syndrome. And so this is from a study, 2019, and this was from Frontiers in Cellular Neuroscience, showing that mast cells are at the key, at the center of these different elements. So we've got the mast cell brain connection, the mast cell gut connection, and all of this communication is going back and forth and working on the endocrine pathways, the immune pathways, our neural pathways, and including our circulation, and can be driven by stress, anxiety, and depression. Now, if we can drive these reactions by stress, anxiety, depression, we also can calm them down with our mind states and very specific limbic system and vagal practices, which are key in the process that I take clients through. Everyone has to do limbic system and vagal nerve work. This is a diagram. This is from Trends in Neurosciences. This was a 2019 article. And what we're seeing here are nerve endings. And this article goes into how mast cells are at every one of the nerve endings. And there's this communication that happens back and forth. So the nerves are releasing neurotransmitters and neuropeptides. The mast cells are releasing different types of mediators that will stimulate the neurons. And you have this back and forth, back and forth. One of the things that happens in trauma is the limbic system gets really dialed up and over responsive. And then there's a reinforcement of this signaling cycle. To break that, we want to do limbic retraining, and we want to do vagal nerve signaling. We want to rebalance that vagal nerve signaling. Then this is showing the mast cell nerve connections in all of these different systems and conditions in the brain. This is from the same study, the same journal article. So all of these brain-related conditions, intestinal conditions, skin, lung, heart conditions. If anyone's dealing with these things, working on their nervous system can calm them down and is a key component. So again, mast cells are going to be found in the limbic system and at the nerve endings. And mast cells, I find this so fascinating. Mast cells actually are involved in affecting our behavior and avoiding toxins, allergens, and responses to stress. They're involved in anxiety, depression, pain, and migraines. These are just a few of the mast cell neurological connections. And this is another one showing our mast cell links here at the nerve endings. This was focusing on the gut. And this one is focusing on mast cells and the nervous system connections in itching. And then this study, if you want to pull it, these are all in the references as well, are showing us how mast cells can release, they can release serotonin, they can make an impact on the IDO enzyme that converts tryptophan to kynurenine, I have trouble with that word, and then kynurenine can convert to quinolic acid, very neuroinflammatory. So mast cells can really influence whether tryptophan becomes neuroinflammatory or gets converted to serotonin. So all of that to say, and to give credence to, that in addressing mast cell issues and any of these conditions we've looked at, we certainly want to address those root causes. We want to look at the right supplements for the right person, the right foods for the right person, and so on. And we have to support this nervous system wiring of the body. And in my practice, that's 50% of the healing process. If somebody's had early childhood traumas, then it may even be 60 to 70%. And it's easy for us to think that that might not be as big of a deal. And I discounted it myself, and I have a bachelor's in physiological psychology and a master's in psychology, and I still did not fully get this until I had walked into a hotel and they had just shampooed the carpet, and the smell kind of bothered me, but I put my luggage down. My husband and I were on a family vacation, went out, we just dropped our bags and went immediately out to dinner. But I'd already had an initial exposure. I didn't think much about it other than I didn't like this smell. And then when I went in the second time, I went into anaphylaxis and couldn't breathe. It had been so long since I'd had any kind of breathing issues, I no longer carried an inhaler. And I had to go sit in the car while my husband talked with the front desk to work out what was going on and get us moved someplace. So I was sitting in the car trying to decide, do I go to the ER where I know I'm going to get more triggered by the smells and the chemicals and the light and the stress? What can I do? And I knew if I went to the ER, the family vacation was over. Now, I always tell people, if you need to go to the ER, go to the ER. But I had done enough training, and I was also trained as a yoga therapist. I'd done enough training to know I might be able to interrupt this. And I knew my body well enough to know where the line was. So I started doing a very specific breathing practice called resonant breathing. And I had a bottle of eucalyptus essential oil. And then I gave myself pep talks and told myself, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay. It's all okay. And I really worked on calming myself down. And even though my breathing was so rapid, I just worked on pacing it and slowing it down. It took me 30 minutes to get my breathing calmed back down, but I didn't have to go to the ER. And that was huge for me. Now, what triggered it was that they shampooed the carpets. When you shampoo carpets, you're going to get mold growth in the carpets. And then, so it was a combination of all of these mold toxins being released from the carpets and the fragrance. But that was a game changer for me. And I knew if I could do that in that kind of situation, I could really drastically change my body's reactions by working on my nervous system, which I dove into and now have my clients do. And I want to just emphasize how crucial that is for people with chronic illness. The next piece that I want us to look at are mast cells and mycotoxins. This is going to be another bit of information. So I want to just invite everybody to take a deep breath because we've gone through a lot, and give yourself just a second to consolidate that. And then we'll look at this link with mast cells and mycotoxins. So I said earlier that mold toxins are the #1 root trigger I see in my practice. Trauma and chronic stress is #2. And then behind that would be Lyme, Bartonella, and Babesia. This was a study that looked at how Alternaria, the type of mold, has been implicated in mast cell activation. We have clear research links with these. And I see quite a lot of people with mouth burning and GI distress, and studies looking at that the mycotoxins released from Alternaria specifically affect the mucosa of the GI tract. This is looking at T2 mycotoxin. This comes from a mold called Fusarium. This was a rat study. This was a study from 1987. So this link has been known for quite a while. And the same author published a study in 1983 that looked at mast cell activation, T2 toxin, and cardiovascular issues in mice. And then this study from 2018 looked at the mast cell cytokine immune response. This is simply observation, but the people in my practice who had the hardest time with COVID had unaddressed mold toxicity. And this is just my personal opinion, that part of the increase in cytokines from mycotoxins and the mast cells being overstimulated significantly from those mycotoxins are contributing to the cytokine storm. Again, that's my opinion, but I think we've got good research that could connect that. This is looking at neuropsychiatric symptoms and demonstrating that mast cells have a major role in the effects of mycotoxin in the body and the major inflammatory cytokine release, particularly involving the types of neuropsychiatric symptoms like anxiety, depression, and autism spectrum disorders. This is a 2018 study looking at the impact of different fungal species and how innate immune cells, including the mast cells, are going to be stimulated by that toll-like receptor we talked about early on, by things like fungi and even the mold toxins, and they stimulate the mast cells to secrete these pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines. And this is a 2011 study, again looking at T2 toxins, trichothecenes, which come from Stachybotrys, fumonisin, and ochratoxin, and that they induce neurotoxicity, and it looks like at the mast cell link. I want to just back up for a second. This study from 2011 was also establishing that mold toxins cause significant nervous system dysregulation. And so this is another reason why, and then we know mast cells are involved in mycotoxins and mold toxicity. This is why everyone in my practice does nervous system work. So this is looking at how fungal species again stimulate cells like the mast cells through toll-like receptors. And I put this in here. This is from a 2007 journal article. This is showing how these mast cells are involved in nervous system signaling throughout. So we have our mast cells sending signals to these other immune cells like the neutrophils, the basophils, the eosinophils, the B cells, the macrophages, and they're sending signals back. So the mast cells are really at the core of the immune responses. So I think of them like the conductor, one of the major conductors of the immune system. And so if your conductor is out of rhythm, your symphony is going to be out of rhythm. And that's how we get these different effects in the nervous in the immune system. Mold toxins have caused significant immune changes. So they will downregulate our Th1 response. This is our pathogen killing side, viruses, bacteria. And then they upregulate the Th2 response. This is the mast cell, increased cytokine, chemokine, inflammatory response. When we have this pattern of decreased Th1, decreased ability to kill off pathogens, and we have this increased chronic inflammation, which is very common, you'll see in chronic inflammation, people either they catch colds and flus all the time, or they say, I never get sick. And if they never get sick, it's usually 99% of the time because the Th1 immune system just isn't launching an attack. So they're catching colds and flus and other pathogens, but they're not getting runny nose and sore throat because their immune system can't fight it. And that's not a good place to be in. When we have this pattern, we have a higher risk of autoimmunity, and the Th2 will trigger the Th17 response. And so that's if the genetic conditions and the background for the person are correct. Not everyone with Mast Cell Activation Syndrome has autoimmunity, but I see it more often than not in the population that I work with. I see autoimmunity more frequently. And this is why I said before that I think that these immune changes that happen with mold toxins in particular are probably a good part of our cytokine storms that we're seeing with COVID. People can't fight things off, and then they have this increased chronic inflammation already, so it doesn't take a whole lot more to just tip into a cytokine storm. Now that said, and again, it's just observation, the people who had already started working on the nervous system, they were working on mast cell supports and mast cell supporting supplements did much better, and they had much better outcomes. And then you can do with that information what you will, because I don't have any studies on that. This is how I think of our order of operations here. So when our clients have insomnia and thyroid conditions and Epstein-Barr and gut issues and allergies and Lyme, the bottom of this pyramid often is mold. Now, not everyone has mold. I do have some people who live in New Mexico and Utah and very dry places that don't have mold. At this point in my career, when I see somebody come in who lives in Washington, they live in Oregon, they live in Florida, they live in Texas, I'm fairly confident already that mold is on the table because of how humid those environments are. But then we still follow up and find out with a thorough intake, and we do mycotoxin testing. But in this order of operations, if you've ever played this Jenga game, you know that the general gist of the game is you pull out a block and you try to leave the tower standing. But we're going to change the rules of the game. We want to pull a block out and we want the tower to fall down because this is our client's symptoms. Now, if we want this tower to fall down, if we pull out this block and fix somebody's thyroid, it might fall a little bit. Or if we pull out this block or this block, it might help. But if we really want this tower to fall down, mold toxins are the first thing to be addressed, along with the nervous system dysregulation and mast cell calming, if the mold toxins are present for a person. And this is because mold greatly disrupts the nervous system signaling, which is critical for so many processes in our bodies that we saw. Mold affects our immune balance. It's going to affect the gut. Any system you can think of in the body, mold is going to affect. Then we see, once we pull that block out and address the mold, what is left standing, and then we can work on that. But if somebody has mold toxicity, it's almost impossible to fix things like chronic Epstein-Barr, chronic Lyme. These are people who've done 2 and 3 years of antibiotic treatment or herbal treatments and they're not any better. Well, often the Lyme is actually gone, but the mold toxins, if they have had it, if they haven't been addressed, they're still going to feel sick. It's very hard to fix SIBO and other gut issues. Remember, mast cells line the gut lining, and mold toxins are dumping in there, dysregulating the bacterial balance. They're keeping the mast cells stirred up. They're keeping inflammation stirred up. So you can do a gut treatment, and it may be that it's like a moving target and you have to keep trying to fix it. Or it may be that they feel better, they stop the protocol, it comes back. If you see those patterns, look for mold toxins. Same with hormonal imbalances. It's not that you don't work on hormones. It's just it's probably going to be a moving target until mold is out, if that's there. Same with sleep issues, mast cell activation, histamine intolerance. So quite a number of people just chase when they've come in, they've just kept chasing the mast cell activation, and they just want, give me 2 supplements that are going to fix it. Tell me what medications to take that are going to fix it. But if we've got these underlying factors, they will help, but we have to address what's under. And then there's some other things that you may come across at some point, including things like salicylate intolerance. So people are having trouble with vegetables. They can have trouble with breathing and ringing ears with things like vegetables. They can't tolerate aspirin. And there's a condition called subclinical porphyria that I've got some podcasts out there if you want to follow up on that. So let's look at special considerations for protocols. I'm going to give you some really specific action steps here. So there's what I call the 8 stages of mold detoxification. So again, this is the first thing I'm looking at in addition to assessing the nervous system. So we identify which mycotoxins the person's dealing with, support the nervous system, and there are some very specific ways that you can do that are very helpful, and we've got some information on the website about that. Have to address elimination. If somebody has constipation, I work on the nervous system, and then we don't do anything else until they can have a normal daily bowel movement. Because you definitely, if somebody has constipation, you don't want to do any detoxing where the toxins are dumping into the gut and then they can't eliminate them. And then those toxins are reabsorbing and they're just going to feel sick. People have to get their water up. I always ask how much water people are drinking. And even the people that are well educated, I'm sometimes amazed that they're not drinking enough water. So we're looking at half their body weight in ounces at a minimum. So if somebody weighs 150 pounds, 75 ounces of water. Then we support the mast cells with some gentle supports. After that, once things are calming down, then people can do some targeted binders. They can support the relevant detox pathways. They look at if there's colonization. So colonization means that there's mold that is colonized in the sinuses or the GI tract. It can colonize in the ears, or somebody may have vaginal infections. Then sometimes antifungals are needed. In mold detoxification, maybe about 20 to 30% of people will feel great if you just get them through steps 1 through 6. But the rest may have some improvements, but it's not gone, and then they usually have colonization at that point in time. Then the last thing you'd bring in would be your biofilm busters, and these are going to be things like proteolytic enzymes, interphase plus, these types of things. So this is an order of operations here. One is addressed before you go on to the next one. These are some special considerations. If you're working with people with mast cell activation, you're going to work with detox. again, I know I keep coming back to it, but you have to have some nervous system supports on board. And I lost a lot of time with people and made a lot of mistakes by not getting this in place. And I just feel like it's my, my responsibility to help shortcut that for some people. The nervous system is key. I have people do a low histamine, low lectin diet for 6 weeks and see if it makes a difference. And we've got a foods list on the website if you're looking for a good one. There are some terrible histamine foods lists online, unfortunately, where people copied from each other and haven't really looked at the research, and that just happens online. Same with oxalate lists. So make sure you're using one that's really validated and from the research literature. And if somebody does not have some improvement in 6 weeks of doing this, then I let it go, because not everyone with mast cell activation has histamine issues. Not everyone with mast cell activation is sensitive to lectins. But really the only way you're going to know is if they do a trial here. Now, I almost never have somebody come into my practice that's still eating gluten. And sometimes people are still eating dairy, but not often, because again, they've already done a lot and tried a lot by the time they make it to me. But this, of course, people would need to stop gluten, they need to stop dairy, they need to not eat sugar. With the mast cell supports, it's very important to start people with mast cell activation syndrome. If they're sensitive, if they come in, they tell you they've been reacting to supplements, it's very important to start them with microdosing. And this means you start them with sprinkles, which is slow. But this is for 2 reasons. If somebody has a dysregulated nervous system and their limbic system is really dysregulated, and they tell you they can't handle smells, they can't handle, they're reacting to foods and supplements, you can assume that they probably have nervous system dysregulation. If you want to get something on board, let's say you're going to start quercetin and you have them take a whole capsule, their limbic system is going to freak out because it's something new and they doesn't know what to do with it. I tell my clients that our nervous system and mast cells are like these beefed up, with mast cell activation syndrome, they're like these beefed up guards of the castle gate, and their body's the castle. And they're hyper vigilant, and they're not happy with anybody, and they're not letting anything in. So if we want to get a supplement in, we're gonna have a much better time if we try to slip a little mouse under the door, so it'd be a little sprinkle of a supplement, than if we charge in with a full capsule. They're not going to let it by. The other thing is, in this population, if you work with people who are sensitive, you're going to have people react to all kinds of things. And I had a practitioner, I was talking about how to just systematize things and make things a little easier for me on the back end. And he said, well, just make a list of 5 supplements everybody in your practice can take. And then that way you've got your starting point. So I spent weeks trying to do this and realized there's no supplement in my practice that everybody can tolerate. And so even baking soda, I have some people who react to baking soda. So if somebody's going to react, it's much better for them to have a reaction at a smaller amount than to react to a whole capsule of quercetin and then they're not happy with you and they don't want to come back. So you might have a better time with these sensitive people. Now, if they're not sensitive, this is just for sensitive people. If they're not sensitive, you don't have to worry about that. The other thing in the mast cell population, it's important to only do 1 change at a time so that you can tell what's what and what's affecting people. And then if they have a reaction, they know. So I have a lot of people who come in and they're like, well, I can't take these 20 things. And I asked them how they started taking it, and they said, well, I started taking these 5 different blends all at the same time. Then you have no idea what's what. So I usually do single ingredient supplements to start people. And then avoid the triggers. So people need to avoid mold exposure. They need to avoid, reduce their stress. So there's quite a number of things there that they can work on. So this is one of my mottos is in the practice: slow is fast, but fast is going to be slow in the long term. And the reason is, if we try to go too fast and the limbic system again goes into lockdown, it can take 4 to 8 weeks to calm that back down again. But if we take our time, we're going to get to the finish line faster. So I've got just a few other really practical tips here for you. And let's do our case study. So we talked about introducing one thing at the same time and don't add multiple things at the same time. I have everyone track each new thing on and their symptoms and any changes on a journal. So I call it a changes and symptoms journal. It doesn't take a lot of time. It's just, okay, today I started quercetin. I did 1/8 of a capsule. Here's what I noticed. And then 3 days later, quercetin, I went up to 1/4 a capsule. Here's what I noticed. That really helps if somebody struggling with something or has reactions, helps you to go back and see what happened and how something might have built. And then really encourage patience with your clients. So let's go to our case study here. So I'm going to call her Wendy. She's 14 years old when I met her. She was having asthma and major food allergies. She was having anaphylaxis, so full-on throat closing every time she was eating foods like carrots. She was having daily constipation. She had both a GI and vaginal candida. And she was having vaginal itching, heartburn, reflux. Some of her other anaphylaxis symptoms were pain in her chest, numbness, and became hard to breathe. She was getting joint pain the day before her period. She was having rashes and itchy skin, particularly with heat and when she had a shower. She was having anxiety. She would have dark spots in her vision in the morning. She would have allergies and sinusitis. And then severe POTS with daily blackouts in the morning when she stood up. This is a picture you might see of mold toxicity and mast cell activation. So we did, this is a Great Plains mycotoxin profile. Great Plains test is very sensitive for ochratoxin. It's not very sensitive for gliotoxin. So if you see gliotoxin show up on a Great Plains mycotoxin test, you probably got a good amount of gliotoxin. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So we started, now she was actually still eating wheat, so we eliminated the gluten, started a low histamine diet. I had her start some breathing exercises. She was 14, so I did what we could get buy-in for. And then started salt water in the morning. She'd have a glass of salt water and drink that before she got out of bed. And that eliminated the POTS, blackouts, and the black spots in her vision in the morning that were from lack of circulation. These were the supplements she started very slowly, one at a time. One note on the vitamin C, I use sodium ascorbate, or it has to be corn-free and ascorbic acid not from fermentation. So most of the ascorbic acid is high histamine because of fermentation. The other option that works well for people is camu. Then we added SPM. This is our form of omega-3s. We added some D3 and K2, baking soda and water, and DAO is diamine oxidase, which breaks down histamine in the gut. She had reactions to the DAO, so we stopped it, and we think she's got a pork allergy, and it's derived from pork. Home, we tested the home, had significant levels of mold, and so they decided they needed to move instead of remediate, but she still fogged the home and to reduce the mycotoxins, and that stopped the anaphylaxis. We used a suppository called Yeast Arrest and topical probiotics, so vaginal probiotics for the vaginal itching. That cleared in 8 weeks. Then we slowly added in these targeted binders for the mold toxins she had. After 4 months on the binder, she was completely symptom-free, other than itching when she retried the DAO. We're going to keep going until all the mycotoxins are gone, and then she'll go to a maintenance plan. This is a second case study, a little more complicated. So I'm going to call her Molly. She was 47 when we started. She had had silicone breast implants she'd already had the explant surgery. Breast implants are notorious for mold toxins because the breast implants are not made in clean rooms, and the silicone or the saline, often when they remove it, you'll see things floating in it. Andrew Campbell is an MD and researcher who's done research on the breast implants after explant and found that they're frequently contaminated with bacteria and mold. And so if they leak, you get mold leaking into the body. She had SIBO with alternating diarrhea and constipation, several food sensitivities and chemical sensitivities. She had a latex allergy, osteopenia. She was getting chronic infections. She also had Epstein-Barr, Mycoplasma pneumonia, HSV1. She was hypothyroid. She had Gilbert's. This is where bilirubin stays chronically elevated. It's a genetic condition from the UGT1A1 gene. She had sleep apnea and a deviated septum. So her symptoms just go on and on. Twitching muscles are frequent mold toxicity, cognitive issues. She had tinnitus, so there was another tip-off for the mold toxins, anxiety, lightning bolt pains, I want to point out. This is very specific to mold toxins. If anybody gets these bolts of pain or intense pains that seem neurological, that's almost always mold toxins. This was her Great Plains test. She had some elevations in ochratoxin, the mycophenolic acid showed elevated, so one comes from aspergillus, one from penicillium. We also ran real time for her, and all 4 mycotoxins that they test for came back as present. So ochratoxin, aflatoxin, trichothecenes, and gliotoxin. This was her GI map, so gut test, stool test, beta-glucuronidase was very elevated. This is a problem when you have any kind of toxicity. Most toxins go through the glucuronidation pathway, and so they get packaged with what's called a glucuronide. Beta-glucuronidase, when it's elevated, cleaves that bond, so that toxin is now available again to circulate back through the intestinal wall to the bloodstream. This is the protocol we took. So we started low histamine, low lectin, and gluten-free diet. She was one of the few ones that was also still eating gluten, and addressed her foods. We started, these were the nervous system supports I had her start. So Gupta program, brain tap, and some very specific vagal exercises. She was bedridden most days when I met her and still trying to cook all the meals and take care of her family. So she set better boundaries. We switched her coffee to a mold-free coffee. We worked on modulating the constipation with magnesium oxide, some digestive enzymes, and betaine HCl. Then we started some mast cell supports, so perilla seed, bakelin, vitamin C, DAO to break down histamine. She added SPMs for omega-3s, vitamin D3, a form of vitamin A called vitamin A acetate. This is a natural form. It's cod liver oil is usually used for vitamin A, but it's high histamine. And then she did add some medications because of the extent of her symptoms. So she added cromolyn sodium, and ketotifen has to be compounded here in the United States. Very, very small amount. Most prescribers are prescribing too high of ketotifen, so this is 0.25 milligrams. Tested home for mold, significant levels. She moved out. She started improving. We slowly added these binders based on the mold toxins she had. After the binders were on board, their symptoms started improving. Then we added in castor oil packs and coffee enemas. Castor oil packs were daily, coffee enemas were 1 day a week to support for lymph and support toxin removal. We added a supplement called glucuronidation assist. This was because of the elevated beta-glucuronidase on the gut panel. And this has calcium D-glucarate and some herbs that help that pathway. She started glutathione 3 days a week, Epsom salt foot soaks for sulfation support. And then this was her repeat GPL mycotoxin, quite significant improvement here. Often on the second test, I see levels go up though, and that's a good sign. It can mean the body's finally excreting. This was her real-time retest, and the ochratoxin had gone down. The gliotoxin, everything had gone down, but trichothecene's much further down, still had some aflatoxin, gliotoxin. Then we adjusted the binders. She was still having headaches and motility issues, so we referred her to an upper cervical chiropractor because of pressure on the vagal nerve. She was getting flared from going to her home during the remediation, so we backed down her supplements and added more backed down the detox supplements, added more nervous system mast cell supports. And the flare calmed back down. We started some antimicrobials with Argentine 23. It's a nanoparticle silver. Gradually increased the silver. She had sinus colonization, so we started working on that. And then she did have to layer in some prescription antifungals. So those were layered in, and then finally some biofilm busters. It took her 1.5 years to build that protocol up, but her symptoms at this point have resolved by 75%. And we're going to keep going until that mycotoxin testing is clear, and she also has to be completely out of mold, both of these cases. So our big picture here is if you work on the nervous system with people, you look for mold when it matches the case, then you're going to be able to guide people who are really dealing with these complexities out of this storm and where they keep falling through the cracks and nobody is able to help them. You're going to be able to help guide them into smooth sailing. And here's our contact information again, if you're looking for more resources. And then all the references are with the slides there. Okay, do we have questions?
Wow, Beth, this is a lot to take in.
It is a lot.
Fantastic, right? Fantastic information. And, I noticed that just given our time constraints, that there was some information that you didn't get to. Do you want to address that at all? Is that being available with the slides or anything at this point that you have to say?
Yeah, I just felt like we went through some supplements to avoid. I can click on those, and I, thought people could step through those. So I talk about these high histamine supplements, things to keep an eye out for if you think somebody has mast cell activation. And we've got slides on some of the top supplements that I use here, and we've got that as a resource as well for you. And so these are the top ones that I do in the practice here. And there's some other practical tips. Did you want me to go through those, Paula, or did you want to do Q&A?
We can do Q&A and then see what kind of time that we have left. There's some interesting information on the food, but if we don't get to it, then it'll all be available on the replay with all of the slides accompanying them.
Okay.
So at least there's that. And if that's not satisfactory enough, I'm going to have you back.
Okay, sounds good.
Talk about it some more. All right, we're going to go back here a little bit to clarify around the criteria for diagnostic. Was it 2 issues in each system or more than one system?
It has to be some symptoms in more than one system. So for example, somebody might have myalgias that move around, and they might have flushing. So that would be very simple. You're probably not going to see a really simple case like that, but that's an example. A classic case that I would see would be somebody might have the classic skin symptoms of the itching, the flushing, and then they might have the GI symptoms. So they might have mouth burning and get trouble swallowing. But I have some people who have, they have the cardiovascular symptoms with the heart palpitations, low blood pressure, and then they mostly have the brain symptoms, the brain fog, insomnia, anxiety. So you can get those kinds of presentations and they may not have the skin symptoms at all.
Can you review some of the examples that you shared about gentle mast cell support?
Yes. around the dosing.
Yes, what you would do, and yeah, and dosing.
Yeah, so let me pull that slide back up here. So some of the critical things I think of are microdosing. And so this is going to be starting people with a little bit of sprinkle of something rather than a whole capsule, or maybe a quarter capsule, depending on how sensitive they are. And you can get a sense of that in a thorough intake.
Mm-hmm.
So we start with these small microdosing, and then we want to start one thing at a time. So rather than layering in multiple things simultaneously, think about one thing at a time. One of the other things that we want to do are our nervous system supports, especially when people are sensitive. So a big part of sensitivities are the nervous system dysregulation. And then we want to make sure, give them a trial of a low histamine, low lectin diet, see how they do. And then bring in mast cell supports as appropriate and tolerated. And we've got, again, the slide of some ideas here. So these are some good starting places.
All right, excellent. Can you talk a little bit about the connection between mast cell activation syndrome and pyrrole disorder?
Yes, that's one of my other areas of research.
Good.
And so pyrroles are intermediates from the heme pathway. And the heme pathway comes off of the Krebs cycle. It comes off about 5 o'clock at succinyl-CoA. Then you bring glycine in, and it takes you through this 8-step enzymatic process and should be converting very, very quickly. So these intermediates that build up that are called porphyrins or porphyrinogens or pyrroles, depending on the structure. So pyrrole is just a type of chemical and structure. Those should not be sticking around the body. There should be this very rapid conversion. Then you get heme at the end, and heme becomes hemoglobin. But also all of the oxygen delivering molecules like myoglobin, cytoglobin. Also it's the base molecule for our CYP450 phase 1 detox enzymes, nitric oxide synthase. A lot of enzymes have heme at the core. When we have toxins or pathogens, and lead and mercury are notorious for this, they will inhibit some of those intermediate enzymes. One of them is called HMBS. And when that one gets inhibited, then you will get pyrrole buildup, or what's called pyroluria. Mm-hmm. And that enzyme is dependent on B6, zinc, and magnesium. Mm-hmm. Those, whether you're talking about porphyrin, any of those intermediates, the porphyrins, the pyrroles, they're quite toxic. And so they will trigger mast cells and mast cell activation as well. And this was one of the special cases I was talking about, that some people truly cannot do low carb, and they may be they may be kind of self-treating with sugar, carbs, and alcohol. And I have people who tell me, you know, they're kind of embarrassed about it, but they'll say, the only time I feel normal is if I have a drink. Well, I had this myself, which is, you know, why I did a deep dive into it. I only felt okay if I had a drink. And that's not, you know, there may be alcoholism, you definitely want to exclude that, but even alcoholics and food addiction, sometimes they have this issue. And so there's some in-depth interviews that I did about that on Better Health Guy, if anybody wants to check that out.
Okay, thank you. You know, the overall reflection here is just, it's a considerable amount of symptoms covering mm-hmm. multiple systems, right? So do you see that underlying conditions like Lyme and mold, it's almost which comes first? Is it always mast cell issues that leads to Lyme and mold, or does mold start first and then affect the mast cells?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we think about that, again, this diagram is super simplified, and there are hundreds more receptors here. When we have pathogens like Lyme and like molds or mycotoxins, then they're going to trigger some of these receptors, and they're going to trigger the mast cell activation. So the underlying toxin or the pathogen come first. And that's why I say we always have to look at what's underneath the mast cell activation, what's keeping it, what's causing this, what's stirring it up.
Yeah. Okay. I really just want to acknowledge how valuable it was for you to bring in the power of the mind in this, in influencing our nervous system, insulin, everything. It's like what we repeat to ourselves becomes activated. So we keep saying, I can't heal, I can't get better, negative influence rather than positive. I mean, it was just a powerful example of you sitting in the car with anaphylactic shock and pulling yourself out of it mentally and with breathing techniques. I think that needs to be incorporated in almost everything, every conditions that we work with our clients, but certainly with this one. Are there other ways that you teach people to work with a level of their mind with this?
I do, and I recommend that every client either do the Gupta program or DNRS, Dynamic Neural Retraining System. They're limbic rebooting, and they're both excellent programs, and some suit some people better, and one suits the other people better. And then there's a number of different types of vagal nerve exercises people can do. Stanley Rosenberg wrote a great book called Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagal Nerve. And there's some exercises in there. Now, these are still working neurological. The DNRS or the Gupta program work on the mindset. And a majority of what I do with people, not a majority, but I would say a good chunk, is encouragement and giving them hope and sharing stories. And I had a practitioner, Neil Nathan, who's one of my mentors, told me one time, he said 90% of people who had your story would have given up.
Yeah.
And just died. And there was always a piece in my mind that I knew there was a key. But if all I had to do was find the key. Now, the key was very complicated and wasn't a simple key. But I just always had this piece. Even when I felt hopeless and desperate and gave up for a day, I would wake up the next morning and go, I know it's out there. And so if we can share that with people and share our stories and share how we got through or how a client got through, it empowers people to know that they can as well.
Right.
So that's crucial.
Yeah, I think essential. Absolutely. Question about case study number 1, or really all of them. Do you continue to test for mycotoxins until resolution?
Yes, I often, and I have a blog on the website on how to determine which binders and which phase 2 detox reports. I was on a team with Neil Nathan and a colleague of mine, Emily Gibler, and Matthew Miller, and Laurie Young, and
Great
Deanna
team.
Minute. And we went through every journal article we get our hands on how mycotoxins are detoxed in the human body. And it took us about 6 months as a team. And we've mapped out the binders and the phase 2 supports with what is known in the research at this point in time. Phase 1 is proving to be an even bigger challenge, but we mapped that out and we've got it on the blog there, and people can just click on blog and then mold, and they're going to find that. But going back to the testing, I typically, because of that, now that we know which binders target which mold toxins and have better affinity for which mycotoxins, I like to recheck about every 6 months after they've got their initial binders on board. Because as you saw with the second case study, when we were seeing different mold toxins at different levels, we had to adjust the binders to bind the gliotoxin more, because now she was excreting more of the gliotoxin and more of the, I believe it was the aflatoxin. So that's helpful where people have the funds. If they don't have the funds, then we might do a touch point in maybe 8 or 9 months in, and then maybe a year later, just to make sure we've got it. And then we keep going 3 months after the mycotoxin testing is clean.
What do you think that, is it possible to say if you have an average time for somebody to come to resolution with this? And I guess overall cost in this whole program of such
Yeah,
labs, supplements and meds and consults.
right. Cost is definitely a factor. So with children, I get a number of children as young as 6 years old to teenagers. They tend to go faster. And I've had 6-year-olds who were turned around in 6 months. They don't usually need the antifungals. The binders usually handle it, and some mast cell supports and some diet changes. And then the hardest part is actually finding some nervous system supports that they'll do. With adults, it depends on the severity and the complexity. So I've had adults who have turned around in a year. I have adults who it's taken 3 to 4 years because they're so sensitive. It might take 6 months of nervous system rewiring before they can take a supplement. It's really variable, and the key is to follow their body's lead and what their body is ready for, rather than setting up an agenda of, we need to have this on board by this date.
Yeah.
It does get expensive, and one of the things that breaks my heart is if somebody is living in mold and they cannot afford to move or remediate, they can't get well. And they can maybe, I always have this image of rolling a boulder up the hill, and they can maybe try to keep the boulder from rolling back down on top of them. But that's about the best that we can do. And so I have them do nervous system supports and some basic binders and some mast cell supports, and that's about it until they can get out of mold.
Yeah. An essential piece of it. So another question, when trying different approaches to address MCA, is there a response? Is the response somehow monitored with a general inflammation test like C-reactive protein, supposing there's a baseline of such marker before starting treatment? Does that make sense?
Yes, I do always recommend people have baseline markers, and I want to see CBC and a CMP. I want to see C-reactive protein, homocysteine, A1C. And I just had somebody today who's new in the practice, and her C-reactive protein was 15.6, which is, it should be below 1. So that's going to be a baseline that we'll follow. Most of my clients have normal blood work, and that's one of the reasons why they're falling through the cracks as well. If somebody has a C-reactive protein that high, they need to get thoroughly screened for autoimmune conditions. But she actually didn't have any, but she does have mold toxicity. She lives in Florida. And in terms of other markers like the interleukins and the cytokines and so on, if somebody comes in with something that's elevated, then we might follow it. But otherwise, I have tried following those, and I just haven't found it worthwhile. And it's hard to get people to get their medical practitioner to order it. And it's hard to get it covered in insurance. So I've let it go.
Yeah, understandable. Wow. I think that's it for questions. Very impressive presentation. It increased my knowledge a lot around this, and I hope for everyone else listening as well. And fortunately, we recorded this, and it'll be available on the Hawthorn website under archived webinars in just a few days. So please avail yourself of the slides and the recording again, and share. You know, Beth O'Hara wants everyone to know about this information. So please share about this presentation. Encourage people to come and visit our archived webinar so that they can inform themselves more deeply on this topic too, and hopefully find Beth O'Hara or some practitioner equally skilled to be able to lead them to state of health again. There's also a survey that you have the option of filling out right after the webinar ends, and I can only tell you how much it helps us to have your feedback and any comments about this presentation. So I sure appreciate you taking the time for that. And I wanted to let you know that our next webinar will be on December 1st, returning with Deanna Batdorf. She's going to come back for part 2 of her Ayurvedic nutrition talk, and that's going to include all of the protocols for who needs what and when and why and when they need it. So the best foods for the doshas, for food cravings. She'll address spicing up your life with some really unique plant medicine and rare spices, global blends, things like that. She gave us a terrific presentation in part 1, and I'm thrilled that she's coming back to go in more deeply into this part of it. So I look forward to meeting you here there again. And our next All About Alumni is where we interview our graduates to talk about all of their postgraduate activities and their challenges and their successes and future plans. So that'll be Wednesday, December 2nd at 12 noon. We've got Ginger Hudak with us. She's a graduate from our MH&E program, one of our masters. And so I expect that to be terrific. She's going to offer some good advice for people that are just starting out. And I think that that's really it. I think it's time to conclude this presentation. It's dinner time for a lot of people, bedtime for some. So I'll just say how grateful I am to work with James Bernardinelli. He engineers all of our webinars, and it's just terrific in the back end and taking care of all of us. I want to thank you again, Beth. So grateful that you brought this to us, and I hope you'll come back again.
I would love to, and thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure and healing for me as well to get to share this. If my nightmare of a healing journey can help others, then it was worth it.
Beautiful, beautifully said, and truly a reflection of you and how you work and walk in the world. So I want to wish everybody the best of health. I sure look forward to learning more together in our Hawthorn's webinars, are all about alumni and in the classroom at Hawthorn. And so until then, all I can say is I'm going to continue to tend to my healthy mast cells and overall health, as well as compassion and kindness, you know, because what we practice grows stronger. So I hope you join me in this too. And I thank you very much for your time and attention here today.